Hi there, and it's time for the top decks in Legacy. I'm joined by Simon Goertzen. And Simon, just for people at home, what is Legacy? Give us a very broad overview.
Legacy is one of the oldest formats that we play, one of the biggest formats regarding card pool. And the way I actually memorize it is, if you know what Vintage is basically all the tournament legal cards with a restricted list. So some cards are only legal once. Ancestral Recall, Black Lotus, and so on. Legacy is the biggest format that doesn't have a restricted list, but only a banned list. So there, Black Lotus, Ancestral Recall are banned. You have to play, if a card is legal, you can play 4 copies of it.
And is it sort of characterized as being a very fast format? You can potentially win on turn 1, is that right?
That's true, and it's true of most Eternal formats, in fact. However, we have Force of Will and blue as, well, not even arguably, it's the best color in Legacy. You have Brainstorm, you have Force of Will, and that keeps the format somehow in check, and games actually go much longer than you would think.
All right, well, let's take a look at the metagame breakdown for Legacy here at this Pro Tour specifically. Simon, walk us through what we're seeing here.
Yeah, you can actually see that in Legacy, players will pick the deck that they like the best. We've had a little bit of behind-the-scenes discussion about how likely players are to show up with Tier 1 decks, but in Legacy, I think the Tier 1 deck is actually the deck you can play the best.
Right, it's very tricky to become a master of a deck in Legacy.
And we have actual masters at this tournament, of course, Masters of Death and Taxes, Masters of Temur Delver, Masters of Sneak and Show. All no surprise that these are in the top 5 decks of the metagame.
All right, Grixis Control tops this list here at our metagame breakdown. Why don't we take a look at what Grixis Control looks like as a deck? Tell us kind of just broadly, what is this deck trying to do and how does it win?
Yes, so this Grixis Control deck list is really generating 2-for-1s with almost every card. You can see Snapcaster Mages, Baleful Strixes, Color Against Commands. All these cards are value generators for very low mana cost. And those that remember, before the banning of Deathrite Shaman, this deck actually used to be a 4-color Leovold deck. And Deathrite Shaman did everything for this deck. It fixed the mana, but also provided a value engine. Now, the deck has gone back to being Grixis Control, the powerful blue shell, Force of Will, Brainstorm, Jace, Snapcaster Mage, and then removal and card advantage mechanisms.
And playing Hem to Torak, that's just fun.
Well, not for your opponent.
No. All right, let's take a look at the next deck here on our list as we walk our way through Legacy, Sneak and Show, and this is one definitely of the more famous decks from Legacy.
Absolutely, one of the mainstays of Legacy. It utilizes the fast mana of City of Traders and Ancient Tomb, as well as Lotus Petal, but it's not all in, because you can even play longer games. You have Force of Wills and Counter Magic to protect your combo, and the combo is, of course, to cast Show and Tell, to put Emrakul or Griselbrand into play. Alternatively, you can also sneak attack them, and either way usually leads to a victory.
How easy is this plan to disrupt, though? I mean, it seems fairly straightforward, right?
It's really, really tricky. The thing is, you can even have creatures in your sideboard that you can put into play with Show and Tell that remove something like an Emrakul when they hit the battlefield. And also fighting through a wall of counter magic and Dazes and Wastelands is not so easy. So even though this deck looks relatively straightforward and simple, I've played the Omniscience version of this, and when you sit there against an actual opponent, it's a lot less easy than it seems.
All right, let's take a look at our next deck in the lineup here, Eldrazi Stompy. Well, I certainly like the name, and I see some familiar faces in this deck here in the likes of Reality Smasher and Thought-Knot Seer.
You like Modern, I like Modern. This looks almost like a Modern deck. However, you have the legality of Eye of Ugin as a big differentiator, plus all the other unfair lands that generate 2 mana, Ancient Tomb and City of Traders, of course not Modern legal. And then you get a super efficient beatdown deck that has a bit of disruption in the form of Chalice of the Void, something that the decks without Force of Will need to beat the really unfair decks of.
Yeah, Chalice seems very good in Legacy if we can stick it.
Against some decks, especially if you can cast it on turn 1, which this deck can definitely do, it just wins the game on the spot.
Death and Taxes is up next in our list of Legacy decks, and this is another iconic deck from Legacy. And actually, when I played a little bit of Legacy, this is actually the deck I played because I like creatures.
It's really interesting that such a creature-based deck, and the creatures are not that spectacular on the surface is actually doing well. Apart from the fact that this has 12 basic planes in Legacy, it's just crazy to me. This deck was actually a little bit on the back foot when Deathrite Shaman was so powerful and popular that the taxing effects, that's actually where the name comes from, the taxing effects of cards like Thalia, Rishadan Port, and so on, were a little bit too easy to circumvent with Deathrite Shaman's activated ability.
I see at the very end there one copy of Remorseful Cleric from M19. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so M19 is making it into the Eternal format. Death and Taxes is trying to prevent the opponent from doing unfair things, taxing their spells, bouncing their legends, but also removing their creatures and their graveyard. And you have to have answers to everything that people are doing in this format.
Teamer Delver is up next on our journey through Legacy here. Tell me about this deck and Nimble Mongoose. Hello, old friend.
I love this deck. I love that it has been around since forever. Old school players refer to this as Canadian Threshold, and that's because Nimble Mongoose was the first real basically threat that couldn't be handled because of its ability, can't be targeted by spells or abilities. That was long before Tarmogoyf was even printed. So if you see somebody play with this deck, the amazing thing is that there are so many cantrips with Brainstorm and Ponder that these few one-offs here, the Spell Snares, the Sylvan Library, the Fire Ice, you can get them at just the right moment to disrupt your opponent for long enough for your Delvers, your Mongooses, and your Tarmogoyfs to take over the game. And often with Daze, you operate on 1 or 2 lands the whole game.
What kind of player likes to play this kind of deck, do you think?
You're always on the edge with this deck. You get a few free wins, but usually you have to somehow grind your way through a game where you know that if it goes too long, you're losing again. So it's exactly this middle ground, this balancing of all factors. Jacob Wilson, for example, has played some amazing games with Teamer Delver that I was lucky enough to watch.
One of my other favorite decks in Legacy is coming up next, and that is Black-Red Reanimator. Let's take a look at this deck here. Reanimate, one of my favorite spells. I love to play it in Cube. Tell me a little bit about this deck, Simon.
Why is this your favorite deck? Because you can have a Grizzlebrand in play on turn 1?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Well, this is actually a combo deck that's super straightforward. You don't have the ability to counter back with Force of Will, so you need the disruption of Chancellor of the Annex and the discard spells, Thoughtseize and Unmask. And then the plan is really simple. You use Faithless Looting or Entomb to put Grizzlebrand into your graveyard, you reanimate it, you animate dead it, you exhume it, and your opponent is usually dead after that.
Because of the straightforward nature of this deck and no Force of Wills and that kind of stuff, no Brainstorms, is this kind of a deck that you might point somebody who's newer to Legacy towards?
I think it would be a good deck to start exploring the format, but still you will have some matchups that feel unwinnable, you will have some matchups that feel really easy. It is very polarizing, so I don't know if it's really the best to get an objective view of what Legacy has to offer.
All right, let's take a look at another super iconic deck from Legacy, and this is Miracles. And this survived what could have been a pretty devastating banning in Sensei's Divining Top.
I didn't expect Miracles to survive. I thought the times of top Terminus, top counterbalance are over, and some of the more innovative players, Legacy players, figured out that Jace is powerful enough, and you have cards like Portent, sometimes even Predict, to still manipulate the top of your library well enough to make Miracles actually one of the tier 1 decks of the format.
So how does Miracles do its thing?
Miracles is one of the very few decks that is aiming to drag out the game as long as possible. And you can deal with almost any threats in the format. Swords to Plowshares, Force of Will, Terminus, you have Jace to bounce, to manipulate the opponent's library. You have a few win conditions in Brightling, often Entreat the Angels is in there. But if the game goes for 10 turns, if the game goes for 15 turns, the Miracles player is happy.
Let's take a look at a deck that we're used to seeing in Modern, and that is Death's Shadow. What is this deck doing in Legacy, Simon?
What is it doing in Legacy? It's fetching out Overgrown Tombs, Breeding Pools, and Watery Graves because of the benefit of dealing 2 damage to you when they come into play. So because a lot of the Legacy decks are not that creature-based, you can actually go down with your life total against a deck like Sneak and Show almost arbitrarily. They're not going to bulk you to death. So Death Shadow can grow as quickly or even quicker than in Modern. And a 13/13, well, it's never going to be 13/13, but
A very large creature.
it's going to be a 10 plus power creature if you really want that. There are some lists that play Berserks as well, so you can be really creative with this deck.
How competitive do you think this deck is?
I think if you know how to play it well, and I think also with the banning of Deathrite Shaman, it has gotten even better than it already was.
Let's take a look at white-blue Stoneblade here. So tell me what this deck is up to. I see a Stoneforge Mystic, of course.
Yeah, so this is a little bit like Miracles, but also plays completely differently. It utilizes the raw power of Stoneforge Mystic. If Stoneforge Mystic comes down on turn 2, and your opponent doesn't have an immediate answer for it, they have to face usually a better skull on the next turn. And I have some friends that keep telling me Stoneforge Mystic should be unbanned in Modern. I don't think that's a good idea. Because Stoneforge Mystic is such an efficient package, and that's almost the whole deck, right? You sit behind a wall of counters, and you have that one threat that only costs 2 mana, and that takes over a game.
And you get a chance to play Umezawa's Jite, which if you've never had it is certainly an awesome feeling. Let's take a look at Eldrazi Post up next. And this deck is also pretty cool. I played a version of this in No Ban List Modern once, and it was pretty fun.
Yeah, I can believe that. It's actually very similar to the Eldrazi Stompy deck. We basically have 3 decks in Legacy that play Eldrazi creatures, and this one is the mid-range version of it. You see that it also plays Chalice of the Void, but in addition there's also Thorn of Amethyst, and the creatures are a bit bigger. To generate the mana for them, you have Glimmer Posts, Cloud Posts, and a few ways of copying lands. Vesuva is one of them. That way, even 6 mana or 10 mana for Ulamog is not out of the question.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Simon, for this walk through Legacy, and it'll be really cool to watch these decks play out this weekend.